It's a pleasure to be here. I was extremely flattered, Kevin, that you asked me to give a presentation today. I respect your work greatly, the work of all of the authors of this book, and it's been a treat to read this work in advance of publication. So just to dispel any misunderstandings, this is an excellent book. It is extremely impressive. I think you simply succeed in making the case that you are attempting to. Charles Darwin aspired to be what he called a philosophical naturalist, and that didn't mean a naturalist that reads a lot of philosophy, although you are naturalists that have read a surprising amount of philosophy looking at the bibliography of this book. The idea is that a philosophical naturalist doesn't merely catalogue diversity in nature. The philosophical naturalist also wants to give a deep explanation of patterns of similarity and dissimilarity, change and stasis across species. And I think the case that you make for the importance of an understanding of developmental processes in all aspects of that project is strong, and for multiple reasons. So you've already mentioned many of these themes. You show the ways in which common developmental biases can influence common evolutionary trajectories, as you put it, and this is why in a brief exchange we had before I said that you had a quasi-typological approach, I think. Development, as you say, brings regularity or order to the production of fitness differences, which derives from potentially knowable and increasingly known mechanisms that determine which characters will reliably be associated with fitness. Also, particularly through work on plasticity-led evolution, you talk about how responsive developmental processes can trigger subsequent evolutionary change, including evolutionary divergence or convergence. And you talk about the ways in which recurrent developmental processes can underpin adaptive accumulation. And that may be through cultural evolution, that may be through other forms of developmental plasticity and exploratory mechanisms. And I don't think you're just attacking a straw man. I think a lot of the time you're attacking Ernst Mayr. So this is a quote that you give in the book from Mayr. The clarification of the biochemical mechanism by which the genetic program is translated into the phenotype tells us absolutely nothing about the steps by which natural selection has built up this particular genetic program. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that there certainly have been at various points strong opposition to the idea of integrating developmental work and evolutionary work. It's interesting to note the context in which that comment from Mayr appears. It's in the Mayr and Provine volume. He's talking about Morgan's skeptical discussion of sexual selection. And actually what happened there is not that Morgan said it's all about natural selection, it's not about development. In fact, Morgan said it's all about development, it's got nothing to do with selection. So Mayr was using this as a bid for focusing on selection processes. Morgan, as he put it, preferred attention, as he talked about sexual selection, to the role that certain internal secretions or hormones play in the development of the secondary sexual characters. And then I think in a section that you don't quote, Mayr continues, that is the study of biochemical mechanism, does not tell us why one species has sexual dimorphism and another species does not, nor does it tell us anything about the function of the sexual dimorphism in the life history of the species. And I think that the work that you do in the book also actually helps directly combat these kinds of claims as well. So in your initial presentation, you mentioned the ways in which developmental mechanisms can help to explain reduced sexual dimorphism in humans. And you're not going to get a well-informed view about trait functions either unless you're using developmental work to tell us what the right grain of analysis is of the traits in question. So you're not going to get very far asking what's the function of those floppy ears, for example, unless you understand that the floppy ears are part of this broader tameness syndrome. And I see that as a point that's made actually in the Spandrels of San Marco paper, although maybe doesn't get as much attention as it should. And I think that these kinds of claims have all sorts of interesting repercussions. They tell us in useful ways about how we might do similar work in similar kinds of areas that picks up on the sorts of exemplars you lay down in the book. So here's just one case that came to my mind. area of work that's interesting to me is the domain of cultural evolution. So Mark is one of your co-authors with Cavalli Sforza, really the founders of this discipline, but particularly, well, this book summarized some of their earlier papers. There's a strand of work in this tradition that you know well, Kevin, that tries to understand the significance of learning biases. Usually what that work tries to do is characterize and understand the dispositions that affect what types of people we use as models to learn from, and to understand the fitness payoffs of learning from different types of people under different circumstances. And I think this work can benefit from the sort of developmental approach that you're laying out. So here's a fairly recent paper on this by Brant Massoudi and Thomas Morgan on prestige-biased social learning. And they say, as many people do, bias is meant in the statistical sense of a systematic departure from randomly choosing another person from whom to learn. And they specifically talk about prestige-biased social learning, which occurs when a learner preferentially learns from individuals who are copied by others. So if you're in the business of not randomly learning from any old person, but choosing from someone who themselves is preferentially copied by others, that's prestige-biased learning. And I think it's useful to ask similar questions about the grain of bias there. So I'm not disposed to just learn from any randomly chosen individual. I'm a lot more likely, usually, because he's a wise person, to learn from Kevin than from a randomly chosen individual. But you might think, well, you've got the grain wrong there. It's just that you learn from credentialed evolutionists, and there are many of those in the room. But then you might say, yeah, but of course, you just learn from credentialed evolutionists because you like to learn from respected experts. And then you might say, yeah, but as well as just experts, you generally learn from the prestigious. But then you might go even further and say, well, you don't just learn from the prestigious, you just learn from the relevant, right? People maybe understand that, by and large, a prestigious individual is going to be a relevant person to learn from, and they can figure that out for themselves. And you might think that the right grain has been reached at one point along this progression, but you might not want to go all the way. And it seems to me that you're not going to get a good answer to that unless you have some kind of developmental story to tell about exactly how prestige-biased learning emerges developmentally. Okay, let me make 3 observations about the book. Kevin covered this nicely in his presentation. So I think there's been a historical strand of Evo-Devo type work that says that development informs evolution, but it informs evolution by shifting focus to a particular kind of structural style of question. So one might still say, why did this population, why did this lineage follow pathway P rather than pathway Q? But the answer for many developmentally informed evolutionists is that you focus more on the structural stability, for example, of variants that lead to pathway P compared with variants that lead to pathway Q, instead of focusing on higher reproductive fitness, which is your classic selection-based way of asking why this trait rather than that one. What was this trait doing that contributed to reproduction better than that one? And it seems to me there certainly is an alternative type of question you can ask that's more developmentally informed. But what's interesting is that you sometimes, I think, take this sort of approach in the book, but it's certainly not the only approach you take, and I think this is important and to be applauded. What you show, I think, is a move away from a gene-focused approach to evolution, an effort to shed light on the black box of development. Doesn't need to signal a move away from a form of adaptationism. And so it seems to me that when you talk about multiple channels of inheritance, when you talk about epigenetic inheritance, for example, you're often approaching that from a kind of adaptationist standpoint, in the sense that you're asking, how is it going to benefit the lineage to have a speedy turnaround way of responding to environmental change? And how might you want to build those kinds of inheritance systems that can then feed into other kind of slow burn inheritance systems? And that kind of engineering style of approach where you try to set different inheritance processes in a context of how they're responding to the demands placed on the lineage, I think is interesting. And it seems to me that you're absolutely right to move between these two styles of approach. It doesn't seem to me that there's any reason to think that you need to solely use one or solely use the other. And in fact, the more structural questions can help inform when the engineering analysis has got carried away with itself. So I just talked about adaptationism. I want to say a little bit about universal Darwinism. Now, when I say universal Darwinism, what I mean is the idea that natural selection, some kind of selection process, is the only way that adaptation can be explained. And for the universal Darwinist, that needn't be selection acting on genetic variation. It might be cultural selection. It might be selection in the immune system. Now, you certainly do talk about the ways in which developmental processes can, so to speak, at runtime, establish adaptations in their own right, okay, through ontogeny. And sometimes you characterize these, and you did this in your initial presentation today as well, as being themselves of a Darwinian character. Okay, so it's not all about selection on genes, but it is often about selection, even if that goes on within the organism. The capacity for adaptive developmental change would be limited if it were not for the employment of clever and remarkably Darwinian processes that operate through iteratively generating variation, testing the performance of variants, and regenerating or retaining valuable functions. But somewhere else in the book, you say, developmental processes are responsible for some of the creativity manifest in adaptive evolution. But while natural selection displays the creativity of the curator, in contrast, development has the creativity of the artist. Now that makes it sound as though you think something really different's going on in developmental time. Because if development just contains a selection process, albeit working on a different kind of substrate, then you would expect both to show the creativity of the curator, albeit curators working at different pace. And so one question, I suppose, that I have for you is to what extent you want to characterize adaptive developmental process, the exploratory processes you're talking about, as very close to selection processes or more distant from those. Okay, this is a section I'm calling Evolution Revolving. I was struck by reading much, much earlier comments advocating very, very similar things to what you advocate in the book. And I'm not saying this to say, oh, this has all been said before. The interesting thing for me is, why does it never stick? Here's one. This was a particularly striking one for me. There's been an undercurrent of thought in the minds of scores, perhaps hundreds of biologists, including many geneticists, over the past 25 years, suggesting that the picture drawn by modern genetical studies is insufficiently adequate and comprehensive. And then they give a list that's really strikingly common to some of the ones that you mentioned. Such doubts have crystallized around the problem of the randomness of mutation, the directiveness imposed by the persistence of cultural preferential trends over many generations, and latterly by the rise of molecular biology with its evidence for highly complex organization at a subsidiary level. Does anybody know what this is? So this is, anybody know now? So that's W.H. Thorpe in 1966, reviewing a book by Lancelot Law White called Internal Factors in Evolution. And even if you go to works like Huxley's Evolution, the Modern Synthesis, you find this interesting nod, of course, to Fisher at the beginning. Fisher's radically transformed our outlook on the subject. But then he goes on and says, any originality which this book may possess lies partly in its attempting to generalize this idea still further, by stressing the fact that a study of the effects of genes during development is as essential for an understanding of evolution as are the study of mutation and that of selection. And much later in the book, Huxley actually leans very heavily on versions of the Baldwin effect, for example, as a kind of plasticity-led evolution, which he seems to think is genuinely very, very important and neglected. Interesting also that he says, equally obvious is my debt to the Morgan School and to Goldschmidt. So he's signaling a debt to Goldschmidt, who then, under Meyer's influence, becomes viewed as some kind of crazy that nobody ever paid any attention to, but in fact, quite the opposite. So there are precedents for enthusiasm, and you know this because you cite very heavily, for example, Waddington's work as well throughout the book. But there are also precedents for skepticism. And again, I mean, this kind of comment I think helps show why that skepticism persists. So this is John Maynard Smith also reviewing Lancelot Law-White's Internal Factors in Evolution. And he's much, much, much less impressed by the book than Thorpe was. Thorpe writes a long, generous review. Maynard Smith writes about a paragraph and a half, and he says, has he in fact put his finger on a major deficiency of evolutionary theory? I do not think so. All he is saying is that many mutations are lethal or deleterious, and that the kinds of variation possible to a species depend on the nature of the species. And then he says, which for me is interesting, this is true but not very illuminating. Now, whenever anybody says true but not very illuminating, I think one thing to say is, well, who says it's not illuminating, right? It's not illuminating given Maynard Smith's interests at the time. And so one thing to ask is, to what extent is resistance to these kinds of approaches driven by kind of formation that gets you in a channel of thinking that a bona fide evolutionary problem has such and such structure and not a different structure, and what can be done to overturn that. This, I think, is a theme that's stressed quite a lot in a nice book by Greg Raddick, Disputed Inheritance. So this is Greg's historical take on why a Mendelian form of genetics appeared to win out decisively over a more Weldonian form of genetics. And one of the things that Greg says towards the end of this book is he talks about, right now, the ways in which school children are exposed to evolution in exams. And they're given things like Punnett squares straight away. On the genetics section of national school exams, it's a safe bet that there will be Punnett squares. Elementary Punnett square reasoning, Greg says, is of course as unit character determinist as it gets. And I think often this helps to explain why, when people express skepticism about a more developmentalist approach, it's not because they think it could never happen. It's not because they think there are no documented cases. It's simply because their training has habituated them to thinking of a certain kind of problem as a pressing problem and other things as peripheral. And one of the things that's particularly nice about your book, and one of the reasons that makes me especially enthusiastic about it is, you know, on the one hand, I think you show this happening again and again. So we were talking about the turtle case yesterday briefly, where it looks as though the biologists studying this had, as you put it in the book, a kind of search image. They kind of know what they're looking for, and it's blinding them to anything else. As you put it elsewhere, the way in which evolution is represented both facilitates research and screens off. That is, encourages the neglect of some causes of adaptation and diversification. And for me, one of the really nice things about the book is the way that you accumulate this fund of really lovely examples, which can then be redeployed. They could be used for teaching, but they could be also used to suggest ways in which other researchers working on maybe a slightly different model organism, maybe working on slightly different phenomenon, could then pick these up and run with a similar set of methods. And that, it seems to me, might be the way to finally defeat these expressions of skepticism that one sees. But again, let me just say congratulations on an absolutely magnificent book. So, well done.